Morning, everyone. This is Jackie Wong from Product Marketing. I'm joined today by Mark Wilder, our Senior Applications Engineer. And today we're going to talk about MotionWorks IEC version 3.6. So just a quick overview of the agenda. I'm going to go over some of the major updates and changes in MotionWorks IEC version 3.6. Afterwards, I will go over our website, some of our online resources, and then I'll pass the floor to Mark, and he will be doing a live demonstrations of some of the features and updates that we talked about. So first, let's go over some of the hardware support update. In terms of kinematics, we added two new kinematic support. One is for the Delta II robot, and the other is for the Scare robot. Other hardware supported, major hardware support that we added is the MechaTroll Inc 3 SLEO bus coupler. It's now supported by MotionWorks IEC. And 2 weeks ago, we did an extensive webinar on the SLEO product itself. So if you have any detailed questions, please refer to that webinar. We should be sending out a recording of that webinar soon. Another hardware support that we added is the Profinet slave module, which Mark will be talking about later on. As far as IDE improvements, there's quite a few, but here are some of the major ones. There's a faster compile time. There's a new plotting tool. Users are now able to set their own alarms. There's improved hardware simulation and as well as project conversion. Last but not least, as far as the web UI goes, now customer can start and stop the controller via the web UI. They can save and restore retained variables. IP setting is now part of the archive transfer. Customers can now set their own custom logo on the web UI, and there are a few new languages that are also supported by the web UI. So that's a quick overview. Now let's take a look at the online resources. As usual, if you go to www.yaskawa.com, under Product, Motion, Controller Software Tools, the first choice would be MotionWorks IEC. Once you click into it, under Software, Download Software, you will see a table of all the different revisions of the software. Click on these links to download MotionWorks IEC version 3.6. And as I mentioned, the new features that I talked about earlier is just a subset of everything that's done. For a whole comprehensive list, please go under Release Notes, click on it, and you can download a PDF that explains all the updates, all the bug fixes that is in this version. And that's all I got. I am now going to pass the floor to Mark Wilder to do a live demonstration of the software. Mark?
Thank you, Jackie. So today we're going to be talking about, as Jackie said, the latest version of MotionWorks IEC. That's version 3.6.0. Build 333 is the release build. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is adding libraries. In the past, when you wanted to add libraries into your project, you would have to just right-click, insert your library, and then choose whichever one you wanted and insert them one at a time, one at a time, one at a time. We have now changed that so we can actually add multiple libraries all at the same time, just by hitting Control or Shift and selecting all of the ones we want to insert, and then choosing the Include button, and it will put them in to our project. Now, it does not put them in any particular order, so you may need to reorder them after this, but as you know, a few versions back, we did start supporting drag and drop in order to be able to do that a little more simply. In my case, I don't want to have any compile errors, so I'm going to go ahead and delete those out of there. And we can talk about the next feature enhancement of MotionWorks. Previously, when we had a situation like what you see on the screen and we have a contact and I want to put that contact here on the enable, we generally hope that control drag would work. But control drag, as you see, pulls out a coil, and that's not really going to work for what we need. So we implemented a new feature by holding down control and shift. When we drag, it now becomes a tag instead of a coil. And we can drag and drop that right where we need it. Similarly, if we can do copy and paste between elements, so if I paste now, this will also be a coil called enable servo. So we can do that copy and paste now. So that's a nice little feature to have. We have a couple new function blocks that are in our YMotion firmware library. We'll go to the I/O here to look at those. The first is called YWrite7LED message. What this does is it allows you to write a message on the 7-segment LED that's on your MP3300 or MP3200 controller. Obviously, a 7-segment LED can't do every character in the English language, so we are limited in the characters that we can use. That little list to the right of the function block are the ones that are supported for this particular function block. Once you give it the message, you can also then determine the dwell time, that is the amount of time each character stays on the screen, and then the final dwell time, which is how long the last character stays on the screen before the message repeats. So, I mean, unfortunately right now you can't actually see my controller, but when that's executing, the string Joe123 will be going across my screen. Each letter will be on for a half a second. This 500 is 500 milliseconds. Except for the last one, the 3, will stay on there for a full 2 seconds before the message repeats. That message will stay up there even after I turn the execute off until I clear it. And you clear it by turning on this clear bit and then re-executing the function block. Once I do that, the 7-segment LED will go on to its normal usage. Now the message that you put on the 7-segment LED is of the lowest priority for things that go on the 7-segment LEDs. So if there is a controller alarm, then it will take precedence over the message that you put on the 7-segment LED. Another new function block allows the user to post their own user alarm. So when you execute this, it puts this unsigned integer error ID onto the alarm stack, and it gives it a source of whatever this string here says. Now, of course, it's going to be displayed in hex, so I tried to come up with a fitting hexadecimal error ID. When I execute this, it now put that alarm on there, and to prove that, I will come here to the web UI and we will look at the alarm page, and we can see we now have an access error with the error ID of ABBA, and the source listed as Mamma Mia. So that acts as an ability for you, the user, to put whatever alarm you want to, and whatever you would like to cause an alarm can now cause an alarm. Going back to MotionWorks now. We'll turn that back off. We've also made some enhancements to how MotionWorks IEC acts in restricted mode. If you're not familiar with restricted mode, that's what happens when you try to open a second instance of MotionWorks at the same time. So here I've opened a second instance of MotionWorks, and you can see up here in the title bar it says restricted. Previously, when you were in a restricted mode, all you could do is pretty much go in and copy and paste particular function blocks. If the project was password protected, you could not enter a password, and also you could not go into hardware configuration under any circumstances. Now, however, we have allowed you to do these things. You'll notice you can't go online. That online functionality is not active. Bunch of other things, you can't change parameters, but you can copy and paste parameters. So, well, not paste, but you can copy parameters. So if you have a existing project and you want to copy the servo parameters from that, you can do that even in restricted mode. So that's a new enhancement that'll make it easier for those of you who have several projects and need to do some copying and pasting between them. And the last improvement, well, we got two more improvements we'll talk about. First, let me get out of the restricted mode one here. We've always had the ability, of course, to compile, and then there's always been the ability to compile and download the changes. There was not a shortcut key for that before. There is now. It is Alt F9, so I'm going to press Alt F9. It's going to build my project, it's going to download my project, and it's going to go online with my project. So with one keystroke, I've done all the things that I need to do in order to be back online and in debug mode so that I can change these values as I see fit. The download changes icon up here in the top also does that same functionality now. It downloads, or it compiles, it downloads, and it goes online. So that's just a little bit of a time saver that will make it a little bit easier when you're making lots of changes to your project to get online just a little bit quicker. The last thing about the main IDE itself I want to talk about is the plotting tool. So this icon that's now on the Yaskawa toolbar that's got the Y and the X on it, this is the advanced plotting tool. What this does is it allows you to take projects that you've saved with Logic Analyzer and plot them against each other. So the first thing you need to do is tell it the directory in which your Logic Analyzer file is saved. So just for clarification, you're going to you're going to take a Logic Analyzer graph of individual axes. You're going to save that, and then you are going to be able to import those individual axes into a X versus Y graph. So I put mine on the desktop, so once I select the directory, it looks for all the Logic Analyzer files, so I choose that. Then it goes through that file, finds all the different pieces of data that are in that file, and asks you which ones you would like. So if I put on the X position, I put X, this would now be X versus time. And if on the Y position I put Y, we can see that what I actually took a graph of was two axes making a circle. So that allows you to do a little bit of graphing to do X versus Y plotting in order to see how your axes are coordinating. So now let's talk, I'm going to go offline here, let's talk about hardware configuration and what's different about that. So let me launch hardware configuration. The first thing I'd like to talk about is simulated axes. We've had the ability for a while now to change or switch the hardware mode on a particular axis that's configured in hardware configuration. When we do that, it says simulated next to it, and basically it's acting as a virtual axis. What this allows you to do is actually program when you don't have all the parts that you're going to need to do the programming. So you can set it up the way you're going to, and then once you have all the hardware, you can just switch it back into non-simulated mode. There used to be a problem with this in that some of the parameters would get overwritten when you went into simulated and then came back, and we fixed that. Another issue is that when you had a dual axis drive, a Sigma 7W, like we have here with axes 6 and 7, if you tried to simulate, you could only simulate one of those. I'm sorry, you would have to simulate both of those at the same time. Now when you go into hardware mode, you can individually simulate one axis or the other axis, or if you want to, you can still, of course, simulate both. While we're on the subject of MechaTroll Inc, as Jackie mentioned, we do now have the ability to have a MechaTroll Inc bus coupler as a part of the system. We have to give it an axis number here. We did a full webinar on this and how these individual axes work, but if you're familiar with how they behave in the Ethernet IP version, this little tool is very similar to that. If you use function modules that have a counter, in other words, like a external encoder tool, you'll see that they do have axes numbers assigned to them, and you can use them as masters for gearing or camming. But basically, it's just a new way that we can do these slices, and because MechaTroll Inc's faster and more exact than Ethernet IP, we can do things like counter modules and be able to use those as masters without worrying about the data rates taking too long. So that's a nice new feature we have as well. As Jackie mentioned, in our group section, we do now have the ability to add 2 new mechanism types. The Delta 2 is a new one. Of course, you can set your individual kinematics so that you can customize this for your own particular needs. We did now make it so that if you go over one of these pictures and click on it, you do get a blown up version of that picture. Oops. And the other new one is the Scara robot. So those are 2 new kinematic features that are now supported. In addition, you can now also add augmented axes to a group. So let's say you have a 3D printer. Well, let's say you have a 2D with an auxiliary axis that's an extruder. Once I assign those first 2, I can also either add a secondary axis, which I could do before, that's just your like x and x prime, or I can choose this add axis, can name it whatever I want to, and it will be a auxiliary axis. This means that when you are doing coordinated moves, this auxiliary axis is not part of those coordinated moves. Before, when we did 3D printers, sometimes we would use like Rx or Ry to actually be our extruder value, but that could cause problems if you're trying to do 6-axis simulation. So now, by setting it to a auxiliary axis and adding it this way, you can basically not worry about any of the actual Cartesian moves. This is not affected by those. This is only affected by commands specifically given to it. So augmented axes is a great new feature. In our option base, we now have 1 new card. As Jackie mentioned, that is the Profinet IO device card, in other words, Profinet slave card. When we put this in, of course, we have a device name that we can configure, and we tell it what status variable we want, and we choose how many input and output words. This will be the same as what you configure on your I/O controller. The device name especially has to be exactly what you configure on your I/O controller, in other words, your master. But those are the only real functions that are part of this Profinet I/O device setup, is the actual device name. The variable is the status variable that we have internally on our controller, then the number of input words and output words. When you save this, just like with the other devices that you may have on Ethernet IP or Modbus, it creates a section of variables where you can come in and add your own variables as you need to. Same way that it's always worked. since we're dealing with the option base, let's talk about one other new feature that we've added. When you're converting from one controller to another, or if you just want to change this option base, previously we would have to remove everything that was in the option base, then change the option base, and then add everything back in. We've changed that. So now if I add an 8-slot base instead of this 3-slot base, it still keeps the card that was in slot 1 and just adds the extra slots as necessary. If you go the other way and you have something in a slot, and now if I try to switch from my 8 back down to a 3, it's telling me that it can't do that because it's not going to have enough slots in order to have that one. So it's confirming that you do actually want to remove that device from the configuration before switching back down. So that's nice. Another one that I'm not going to actually show you live, but another change to project conversion is if you're converting from a MechaTroll Inc 2 to a MechaTroll Inc 3 controller. It's smarter now about how it reassigns the node numbers. You don't have to delete the nodes out and then convert and then add the nodes back in. So that's pretty nice as well. 2 more new features. Right now I'm connected, well, I'm not actually connected. Let me go ahead and connect here. Before I do that, let me remove that. But I'm connected to 207.66. Previously, if you were sending an offline configuration, one thing that did not get sent as part of that was the IP address. So if you wanted to change the IP address, you had to go online and then change the IP address, and then you could send things offline. Now, I'm going to go ahead and change this to, I'm going to go offline again though. I'm going to go ahead and change this to access 69 instead of 66. And when I go to send that now as an offline configuration, there's an extra question down here at the bottom, query to update IP settings. So it's going to check, and if the IP settings are different, it's going to tell me that, and it's going to ask me, do I want to keep the existing IP settings, or do I want to change them to the settings that are in the file? So this will help you out if you're trying to change the IP address of your target controller. You can actually change it now in the TCP IP settings. Check that box, and you'll be able to change it on the fly. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and keep it. One last thing then about hardware configuration, and this is actually true of the IDE as well, is this new icon up here. Looks like a globe. That will launch the controller's web UI. Let me show you where it is in the IDE. That's this button up here. It's a little harder to figure out what that's supposed to be. But either one of those, if you click it, will simply go to the IP address of your controller and open up the web UI for that controller. And now that we're in the web UI, let's talk about it a little bit. First thing under user is we have 3 new languages that are supported. We now have 12 languages total. The new languages are Italian and Czech and Russian. I speak none of those languages, so I'm going to go ahead and switch back to English. And I'm going to go ahead and, well, before I log in, let me show you one other thing. I'm not logged in right now, you'll notice. And when I go to the status, I now have this new badge next to the PLC that tells me the status of the PLC. Is it running or is it stopped? That was not there before. Can't change it, but it is there. Once I log in, now under operations, I again have that same badge, but now I have control over that as well. So I can stop and start my PLC from the web UI interface. So when I hit stop, it will ask me, are you sure you want to stop it? And if I am, I can go ahead and say that, and now you see that the PLC status says stopped. Similarly, if I want to start it, It will ask me, do I want to do a warm start or do I want to do a cold start? And I can choose as appropriate. This is especially important because with version 3.6, another thing that we've changed is that the controller will no longer automatically perform a cold start if a warm start is not possible. So in previous versions of the firmware, if the controller determined that a warm start wasn't possible, it would just do a cold start and it would wipe out your retained variables before you could do anything about it. That no longer happens. Now, if it cannot do a warm start, it just will not start at all. You have to come in here and manually start it, either through the web interface or through the MotionWorks IEC. Because of this, now if it can't do the warm start it wants to do, and it wants to do a cold start instead, before you restart it, you can actually come in here and save your retained variables. Now, right now it's not active because I'm not allowed to do this while the PLC is running. But if I stop the PLC, I can now save my retained variables to a file. Now, there are a few little caveats to this. First of all, in order to save it, it not only needs to be marked with the retain attribute, it also needs to have the PDD attribute selected. If it has those two things, and you come in here and do save retained variables, its value will be saved. However, in restoring the variables, if a variable's data type definition is changed, including any element of a structure, then we can't restore that. Let me explain what that means. If I have a variable that was an integer when I save my retained variables, and in the file itself I change it to a dint, then when I try to restore it, it will not be able to restore that because the data type is different than it was. Or if I have a structure and deep down in that structure there's an integer, and I save my retained variables, it's a retained structure, then later I change that one single element of the structure buried deep down, it was integer and I change it to double integer, then that entire structure cannot be restored. So changing any part of a structure will prevent restoration of that entire structure. Still, this is a nice feature to have, and it's one that we didn't have before, so it allows you to actually save the variables that you've set that are retained and be able to restore them later. It just saves them as a zip file, and when you restore them, it's just opening that same zip file. If some cannot be restored, there will be a message here that tells you that they can't be restored, and you can go into the debug view and actually look at the individual ones that could not be restored. Similar to the hardware configuration, we now have the ability when we do an archive and we send an archive, we have the ability to set the IP address of the controller to a value that was included in the archive. And that value will be in the startup, and then it will be network.xml. So what this means is if I'm an OEM and I'm creating a copy of a machine that I've already done, I can go ahead and leave my controllers at their default state of 1.1 and just download this archive with this box checked. And after I reboot that controller, it will be at the IP address that I've specified in the archive. So it'll make it a lot easier for OEMs to be able to duplicate machines and things like that. By default, both in hardware configuration and here in Web UI, it works exactly the same as it did before. So you don't need to do anything different if you don't want a different behavior. It works exactly as it did before. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is the ability to put a custom logo on the Web UI. So right now we have this Yaskawa logo, but we now have the ability to change that. What we do is we need to put a specifically named file in a specific location. And we're going to go ahead and do that. So that's under the local directory. And we need to create a new directory, and it needs to be called custom logo. And under that, we need to put a PNG file that's also called customlogo.png. Now, this new custom logo has to be a very specific size. It has to be 25 pixels high and 125 pixels wide. 25 high and 125 wide. It's the same as our little Yaskawa one here. So I have one on my desktop that I've already created. And now, after I send this and I reload the controller here, you can see I now have a new custom logo here. This one happens to be a logo for my dog's website. So that's very easy to do. If you want to go back to the Yaskawa logo, simply delete the custom logo. And again, when you restore it, you'll go back to the Yaskawa. So it has to be in that specific directory. It has to be under local custom_logo directory, and it has to be called custom_logo.png. And if the controller finds that, then it will put that custom logo up. And if it doesn't find it, then you will get the standard Yaskawa logo. We have a couple questions. The first is not really a question. It is a nice point about the Yaskawa website, which is that we have the ability on the Yaskawa website to go straight to our software or our firmware download pages. So if we want the newest MotionWorks IEC, we can go to www.yaskawa.com/IECSW. That's IEC software. And when I do that, I will go straight to the software download page where I can get that information. Similarly, we can do www.yaskawa.com/IECFW. That's IEC firmware, and that will take us straight to the firmware download page. So those are two nice little shortcuts to have in order to get straight to the software or firmware downloads. Another question we had was in regard to the test dip switch on a MP3300 or MP3200 controller. Normally, if you have that test dip switch on, then your IP address will cycle on the 7-segment LED. So the question is, does that override the value that we put in with our new function block? Here, this write 7 LED message. The answer is no. The 7 LED message actually is not the very, very lowest priority. It does take priority over the test switch being on that cycles the IP address. So if you do both, or if you have the test on and you execute this, then the message that you tell it to put on will override that. Don't forget that we did a webinar on some of the new features that are supported, like the MechaTroll Inc 3 bus coupler. So you can find that on our website as well. And oh, one more question. Can we open the retained variable file with Excel? I believe it is an XML file. We'll see if I'm correct about that. Oh, it is a CSV file. So yep, you can actually open it with Excel. I think actually when I saved this, I didn't actually have any retained variables, so that's why there's nothing in there. But it does actually save it as a CSV file. And this type list actually talks about the data types as well. So it does look like you can open it as a CSV though. All right, thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.